My beloved child, stay with me for a moment, because what you are about to hear begins with a name whispered inside a hospital room, and that name was yours. The room had been quiet for hours. The lights were low, the hallway outside nearly empty, and your soulmate had been surrounded by people who cared, yet somehow they still felt completely alone. Then, when the hospital finally allowed one visitor, someone close to them asked a simple question: "Who do you want to see?" There could have been several names. Family. Friends. Someone who had been standing nearby all along. But after a long silence, your soulmate finally spoke your name. And that single moment changed the atmosphere completely. Because this was not a casual request. This was not a name chosen out of convenience. It was the name that came to their heart when everything else became quiet. As this unfolds, clarity will come. You may have wondered why they became distant, why certain conversations were left unfinished, or why it sometimes felt like they were carrying words they could never bring themselves to say. But now imagine them lying there, looking toward the doorway, knowing they might only get one chance to speak honestly. And instead of asking for someone else, they asked for you. Something huge is waiting for you, and the most surprising part is that they may have already made a decision about your connection before anyone even told you what was happening. There is something about a hospital room that makes people stop pretending. When the noise disappears, priorities become painfully clear. Your soulmate had time to think about everything. The moments they remembered, the words they never said, the distance that grew between you, and the possibility that you might never understand what was truly happening inside their heart. Then came the question again: are you sure you want them? And this time, your soulmate did not hesitate. They confirmed your name. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Someone who had been nearby apparently asked why they wanted you there. Your soulmate looked away, became emotional, and said something that revealed just how deeply this connection had affected them. They explained that there was something they needed to tell you themselves. Not through a message. Not through another person. Not through a conversation that could be interrupted. They wanted you in front of them because there was one truth they had been carrying for far too long. This may resonate as we continue, especially if you have ever felt that there was unfinished business between you and this person. Maybe you sensed that their silence meant more than silence. Maybe you noticed that every time the connection seemed finished, something pulled the story back into your thoughts. And now the reason may finally become clear: they were not simply trying to move on. They were trying to understand what they truly felt before they made one final emotional decision. But here is the part nobody expected. When they were told that you might actually come, their entire expression changed. For the first time in a long while, they seemed relieved. Someone asked them what they would say when you arrived, and they reportedly answered with something incredibly simple. I just want them to know the truth. Think about that sentence. Not, I want them to forgive me. Not, I want them to stay. Not even, I want everything to go back to the way it was. They wanted you to know the truth. And that means the conversation waiting behind that hospital door may be far more important than you realize. Your soulmate may finally reveal why they pulled away, what they were afraid to admit, and why certain decisions were made without explaining them to you. There could be one specific moment they keep replaying in their mind, a moment involving you that they never properly understood until now. And when you hear what that moment meant to them, you may look back at the entire connection differently. Something huge is waiting for you, but do not rush ahead, because the final piece is the one they apparently saved specifically for you. They had already rehearsed the words in their mind, but every time they tried to say them, emotion stopped them. This time, however, they knew they could not leave the conversation unfinished. And then came the moment that nobody in that room could forget. The door opened, and your soulmate looked toward the entrance, waiting to see whether you would actually appear. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then their eyes settled on the doorway, and the emotion they had been holding back finally surfaced. They had called your name because, at a moment when everything felt uncertain, you were the person they wanted beside them. But what they were about to tell you was not simply about the past. It was about what they now understood. They wanted you to know that some of their distance had never meant a lack of feeling. Some of their silence had been connected to confusion, fear, and words they did not know how to express. And there is one sentence they may have been waiting for the right moment to say, the sentence that could completely change how you see their actions. Stay with me for a moment, because this is only the beginning. The hospital allowed one visitor, and your name was the one they called. That alone says something powerful. But the real revelation is not that they wanted to see you. It is why you were the only person they wanted to see when they finally had the courage to choose one name. There was something different about the way your soulmate looked at the doorway that day, because they were not simply waiting for a visitor, they were waiting for the person they had been carrying in their thoughts for far longer than anyone realized. And when they finally saw you, the room seemed to become completely still. Your soulmate did not immediately speak. They simply looked at you, as if trying to memorize the moment. Then came the first words, quiet but powerful, "I didn't know if you would come." Those words carried everything they had been unable to say before. They admitted that they had imagined this conversation many times, but every version ended with them staying silent. They had wondered whether you still cared, whether you would understand, and whether the distance between you had become too great to cross. But seeing you there changed something. Their expression softened, and they finally began telling you about the memories they had never forgotten. One particular memory stood out, the moment they realized your presence affected them differently from everyone else. They had tried to dismiss it, convince themselves it was temporary, and even act as though the connection meant nothing. But deep down, they knew that was never true. Stay with me for a moment, because what they revealed next may explain something you have questioned for a very long time. Your soulmate then confessed that there had been a period when they deliberately kept their feelings hidden. Not because you were unimportant, but because you had become too important. They were afraid that admitting the truth would change everything. They feared that if they opened their heart and you did not feel the same way, they would lose the connection completely. So instead of moving closer, they created distance. Instead of explaining themselves, they became quiet. And instead of telling you what was happening inside, they convinced themselves that silence would make everything easier. But it did not. Every time they heard something that reminded them of you, every familiar place, every unexpected memory, every moment when they wanted to reach out but stopped themselves, the same question returned: what if I had just told them the truth? This may resonate as we continue, because sometimes the person who appears the most distant is carrying the most unfinished emotion. Your soulmate admitted that they had replayed certain conversations again and again, wondering whether one different sentence could have changed the entire direction of your story. Then they looked directly at you and said that there was one thing they regretted more than anything else: not loving you, but making you believe they did not. Before we go deeper, if this story is resonating with you, take a moment to share this video with someone who may need to hear it, and stay connected by subscribing. Not because you have to, but because the next part of this story reveals the one realization that your soulmate could no longer keep hidden. Now, imagine the room becoming quiet again as they finally reached the part they had been preparing to say. They told you that something happened during the time you were apart. Something that changed their understanding of your connection completely. They realized that moving forward without addressing what existed between you did not give them peace. It only left an empty space that no new conversation could fill. They began to understand that certain people enter our lives and leave memories, while others leave a question that refuses to disappear. You had become that unanswered question for them. And then they said something that made the entire conversation feel different. I thought I was waiting for the right time, but I finally realized there may never be a perfect time. Those words were followed by a long pause. Your soulmate took a breath and finally revealed that the reason they called your name was not simply because they missed you. They wanted you to hear something directly from them before circumstances, hesitation, or another misunderstanding could silence them again. And then came the revelation they had been holding back from the very beginning. Your soulmate told you that if they had been given the chance to choose only one person to hear their heart without interruption, they would still choose you. They explained that the connection had taught them something they could not unlearn. Sometimes the person you try hardest to forget is the person who reveals what you were never willing to admit about yourself. They remembered your kindness, your presence, the small things you probably thought they never noticed, and the moments when you stayed even when they gave you reasons to walk away. They finally understood that those moments mattered. They admitted that there was a sentence they had wanted to tell you for a long time, but they were waiting until they were certain. Now, sitting there with you in front of them, they were certain. You mattered to me more than I ever allowed myself to show. That was the truth. But there was still one final question hanging between you. If they finally understood what you meant to them, what were they planning to do after leaving that room? Because the answer to that question could change everything you thought you knew about this connection. Something huge is waiting for you. And the next revelation is not about what happened before, it is about the choice they are preparing to make now. The moment your soulmate finished those words, something inside the room changed. They had finally said what they had been carrying, but instead of looking relieved, they looked as though there was still one more truth standing between them and complete honesty. They lowered their eyes for a moment and whispered, "There is something else you don't know. Stay with me for a moment, because this is where the story becomes deeper than a simple reunion." Your soulmate explained that while you were apart, there had been moments when they almost reached out to you. More than once, they opened their phone, found your name, and started writing a message. Then they stopped. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they had too much to say. They were afraid that one message would reopen everything they had tried to keep under control. So they kept deleting the words. They told themselves that silence was better. But every time they did that, the same thought returned: what if they think I never cared? And that thought stayed with them. They realized that perhaps the greatest misunderstanding between you was not a lack of feeling, it was the fact that both of you may have been waiting for the other person to make the first move. Then your soulmate revealed something you probably never expected to hear. During those quiet periods, they had been noticing little reminders of you everywhere. A familiar phrase. A place you once talked about. A song that brought back a specific memory. Even ordinary moments somehow became connected to you. At first, they tried to ignore it. But eventually, they stopped fighting the feeling and started asking themselves why your memory continued to return. As this unfolds, clarity will come. Your soulmate realized that they had been measuring every new connection against the feeling they experienced with you, even though they never admitted it. They said they could meet people, talk to people, and continue with life, but something always felt incomplete. And then came the sentence that made the conversation almost impossible to continue: I kept thinking I would forget you, but I kept remembering you instead. There was no dramatic speech after that. Just silence. But sometimes silence says more than 1,000 explanations. Your soulmate finally understood that the distance had not erased the connection. It had only forced them to recognize its importance. Then they reached for your hand and told you about the one moment that changed their perspective completely. It was not a grand event. It was something small, something you may not even remember. But to them, that moment became proof that you saw them differently from everyone else. You noticed something about them when they were trying to hide it. You listened when they expected to be ignored. You gave them a kind of understanding they had not asked for but deeply needed. At the time, they acted as though it meant nothing. Now they admitted that they remembered it clearly. You probably forgot that day, they said, but I never did. That sentence carried years of emotion. And suddenly, you understood why they had chosen your name when given one opportunity to see someone. They were not simply asking for company. They were choosing the person connected to one of the most meaningful chapters of their life. If this story is resonating with you, share it with someone who may understand this kind of unfinished connection, and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because there is still one thing your soulmate has not told you: the decision they made before you ever walked through that door. Finally, your soulmate looked at you with a calmness that had not been there before and said, "I know what I want now." That sentence made everything feel different. They explained that they no longer wanted to hide behind confusion, timing, pride, or unanswered questions. They did not know exactly how the future would unfold, but they knew they could not continue pretending that you were just another person from their past. You had become part of a truth they could no longer ignore. Then they revealed that before asking the hospital to let you visit, they had already made one private decision: if you came, they would tell you everything. No more half-finished explanations. No more pretending that the connection meant less than it did. No more allowing silence to speak for them. And just when you thought the revelation was complete, your soulmate said there was one final thing they needed you to understand. They had not called your name because they were looking backward. They had called your name because, for the first time, they were willing to look forward. But what exactly did they want to build from this moment? What decision were they prepared to make once they walked out of that hospital room? That answer was still waiting, and it was far more emotional than you could have imagined.